Today we're going to talk about how we listen to whales and dolphins to learn more about them. And I'm affiliated with NOAA, the Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center, as well as being a PhD student at the University of Manoa. So, here in Hawaii and the Central and Western Pacific in general, we have at least 25 species of cetaceans that exist here. And that's quite a list. So if you think about it, a lot of these species are very different. A lot of them do have some similarities as well. But for us at the Cetacean Research Program, we are responsible for studying all of these species and assessing them each year. So it's valuable for us to have as many methods as we can to study all of them and make an accurate assessment of them. So some of the ways that we collect data about all of these species is with visual observers. And we go out on either a NOAA ship, or sometimes we use smaller boats to conduct our research. And usually it's a team of observers that are using high-powered binoculars to search for animals as we go down our track lines. And what they're doing is looking, and as they find animals, they try to identify them to species as much as they can. And then they estimate how many individual animals there are within that group. So that goes along with taking photos of these animals to see if they can match up individuals later on from other data sets from the previous years. There's also satellite tags that we deploy onto their dorsal fins, which help give us location data after the fact. So sometimes those last for months, and you can see a whole track of where these animals have been. And also, we take tissue samples, and those are mainly used for genetic analyses to see who exactly the species is, if there's some that look very similar to each other. Yeah, question?
Yeah, something died recently from a tag, infected tag.
Okay, I can't remember what species that was, but it was a killer whale in the Northwest. Yeah, from, I think, Cascadia Research Collective deployed that tag. So I think they... I'm sorry? Yeah, so they have stopped that type of data collection right now, just to investigate how
is that
it's affecting them.
Known incident of
a mortality.
Of a tagging death or infection?
I believe so, and it's also possible that it was a cause of death was also a number of things other than just the tag. So in reality, these tags are meant to just puncture the dorsal, but also be able to fall out as the wound heals and not cause injury to the animal. So just going with a brief history of passive acoustic monitoring, because this is the next tool that we are trying to use more to collect data about these species. So just to briefly define it, it's basically just listening for the sounds created by animals, the environment itself, and us. We make a lot of noise out there. So it's a good way to monitor all of those sounds. The actual real research to develop these methods began during World War II. And not surprising, because that's when we were being attacked by enemy subs in the Atlantic, and the research had been started during World War I, but World War II is when it really had a lot more money and effort put towards this technology. The methods weren't really widely dispersed until after the war, and then that led to sort of the first actual scientific recording being collected in 1949. So that was quite a few years ago, and it was of a beluga whale. So that kind of spurred some more research, but even in the 50s, the different sound surveillance systems from the Navy were continually detecting what they deemed as biologicals, because they knew they weren't man-made, but they didn't really know what they were. actually identified to be blue whales and fin whales. So that's kind of interesting. The Navy was actually conducting research without even really knowing. And so over the last, I don't know, 60 or so, 70 years, we've really developed a lot of different passive acoustic monitoring systems that all kinds of research is being done using these. And we have everything. We'll go over them in the next few slides, but just to give you an idea, this one up here is a bottom mounted array. There's what we have, sea gliders. These are acoustic tags that they're deployed using suction cups. We're actually still using Navy technology with sonobuoys so that we check over the side of the boat to record baleen whales or blue and fin whales. And then some research is done collecting Tote Array data, which we'll get into in a few minutes. But just to make sure we're all kind of on the same page, and just to know why we're here to learn about passive acoustics is, why do we even use it in the first place? Well, we're studying live underwater. That's their primary habitat. So that can make it hard to actually see them when we're out there on big vessels or smaller boats trying to look for them. And some are more cryptic or harder to see than others, such as these ones. So I believe the top, that's a type of whale, a beaked whale, which I'll talk a little more about. And you can't really even pick out what these are unless you were a lot closer and more of an expert observer. So sometimes these animals are just really it's hard to know who they are. So there's also a plus with using passive acoustic monitoring in that during poor weather conditions or when the seas get really high and the waves are humongous, it's impossible to see as many animals as you can. And this is a bit of an exaggeration, but it does get to be pretty gnarly out in the water sometimes where visual observers can't even work for a few hours because the conditions are so bad. And then also passive acoustic monitoring allows us to study these species in really remote areas. So for example, this star here is at Wake Atoll, and that has an acoustic monitoring system there, which is literally picked up and dropped off by a passing ship. So it's completely opportunistic to be able to collect data at that site in the middle of the ocean. And that's super valuable to know and to gather information about some species we may not ever know about. And same goes for these sites here, sort of towards the equator more, Palmyra and Kingman Reef and near Jarvis. So we're not able to physically go out on a ship and survey a lot of the areas here, and passive acoustic monitoring systems allow us to still collect data. And in that respect, they're a lot more cost effective, so we don't have to hire a whole crew of scientists as well as a whole ship. And all these data that we collect are used to help us better understand these different aspects of the cetaceans, and so where they are, how they are distributed around these regions, what they're doing there, how many there are, just kind of where they move. Those tags help us track them, but the satellite tags track them, but the acoustic monitoring systems help us detect them as well. And then we just know a lot more about what kind of habitat they prefer and perhaps what areas we need to focus more management efforts or conservation efforts on. So it's a really valuable type of data. So in talking about passive acoustic monitoring, just to give a little background about what sound is and what type of data it is. So underwater sound is basically pressure waves that are moving at a certain rate and certain height, making the molecules move back and forth. And that's essentially just a vibration of these molecules, which certain patterns are what create the different qualities of sound themselves. So some of those qualities that we tend to focus on in the passive acoustic data or include the wavelength of the sound, meaning how far is that distance between that peak and that peak. And that can be really, really long, like meters long, or really, really short, depending on the animal that's producing the sound. Another characteristic of sound we focus on is amplitude, basically how loud or how quiet the sound is. It's interesting, well, to me it's interesting that it's just basically the height of the wave. The wavelength itself is the same. It's just adjusting the volume of the sound. And then one of the most important ones we focus on is frequency. And so that's just the rate at which the sound is actually vibrating. So there's lower frequencies and higher frequencies. So this rate is a lot higher, obviously, than that one. Larger animals or cetaceans tend to make lower sounds, lower frequency sounds. And the smaller the animal, the higher frequency sound it can produce. There's caveats to that rule, but that's the general pattern when we're working with acoustic data. So when we're actually working with the data itself, some people ask me, oh, so are you sitting at your desk listening to your data all day? And I actually say, you know what? No, we're actually looking at what we call spectrograms of the sound, or this is a long-term spectra showing about just under an hour's worth of sound in one screen. And to know what we're looking at here, so the brighter the color, there's more energy, you can say. There's more energy at that point in time, because there's time on the x-axis here, and this is the frequency. So lower frequencies up to the higher frequencies. And that's basically how we analyze acoustic data, is to scan through the files or the recordings themselves and pick out places where we find more energy, and then we can zoom in to get a better idea of what's actually there. So this bottom spectrogram shows these white lines, and those are actually echolocation clicks from a dolphin, and with these squiggly white lines down here are their whistles. So these are just an example of different calls that these animals can make and how we're looking through this data to find them. And they can be used for all sorts of different analyses, including ways to classify the animals to species using their clicks or their whistles, or simply knowing, oh, there were animals present at this time and this day at this site. And it pretty much anything that makes a sound can be recorded. It doesn't just have to be animals. We can hear everything, including shipping lanes and boats going by, and even Navy activity sometimes. And then primarily our analyses like to focus on species that are harder to see visually and probably threatened because we're not well studied, so we don't really know a lot about them. So that's where passive acoustic monitoring can really be helpful in learning more about these different species. Okay, so I'm just going to go over a few different types of actual systems that we use at the Cetacean Research Program. I showed a few pictures earlier, but this is our Tote hydrophone array system, and that is our Navy ship, or sorry, our NOAA ship with the cable connected to our Tote hydrophone array here, and just we're listening to everything as we cruise down the track line. There's also autonomous recorders that don't require us to be on a ship constantly listening. And those include these bottom-mounted hydrophones, which is seen here. So those are usually just dropped off the side or dropped off the boat onto a certain area that we know of is, at a certain depth. And they can be deployed for months at a time. So they could be there for 3 to 6 months, depending on the battery power and how you set up the recordings. And these ones also record anything, skipped ahead here. Those record anything from baleen whales to higher frequencies animals of dolphins or different porpoise. Okay, so these two devices are sort of deemed the free swimmers. This one here is sort of it's a drifting buoy system that you check off the side of a larger or smaller boat, either one, and you retrieve it later when you have the time after you've done all your photos and counted all your animals. This here is called the Sea Glider, and these are buoyancy driven, which I'll talk about a little more in a few minutes. So first we'll talk more about the towed hydrophone arrays, and this is my area of expertise. I actually joined the Cetacean Research program to sort of bring up this type of monitoring system for the program, and I built this array here, and this is a better depiction of this diagram, where there's this here represents this little node, and then there's a second array behind it. So in each node there's at least 2 hydrophones, and that'll help us do a lot of neat fun research as we go along down our track lines. But let's see. Yeah, and it helps us collect acoustic data even when the ocean is really rough and the seas are really high, and it's just harder for the observers to collect data. And they're built using acoustically transparent materials, which basically means they're made of plastics and other materials that are very similar density to seawater, so they don't obstruct the signal coming from the animal. You can imagine if you used metals or really dense materials that the sound would be obstructed and you wouldn't, the data would not be as accurate. Ooh, questions? Yeah, in the back.
How long and how deep does it go? Like, isn't there boat interference?
Well, yeah, this diagram doesn't do the best job at depicting. It's actually 300 meters behind the ship as we're going down the track line. So they've tested it where at that point the boat noise is not interfering. Yeah, question?
You stole my question.
Ah, okay.
But, do you retrieve the ones that you drop off?
You mean the bottom mounted, or do you mean this one?
No, that one's not dropped off.
Okay, yeah, I'll get to that one in a moment. Actually, I'll talk more about that. But yes, we do retrieve them. So for the Tote Arrays, basically we're able to record continuously. So we're out on the boat for 30 days at a time, and we can record for 24 hours if we want to, and meaning through the night. We're not necessarily sitting there for 24 hours, but this is kind of our acoustic station. And basically our main goal is to also detect animals as we are cruising and localizing them in order to track them, so that we can actually help the visual observers find the animals if needed. So that looks like this when we're looking at our screens. So this is another spectrogram example, and we actually can make a box around a whistle or an echolocation click, and this software has an algorithm that calculates the difference in time of the arrival of the signal. So the signal coming from the first hydrophone and then onto the second hydrophone, and that time difference helps us get a bearing or an angle to the sound source, and then we plot that angle here, and as we're going down the track line, and we keep getting angles, and hopefully they all converge on an area that we can estimate, okay, the animals are either on the left side or the right side. There's newer technology that's being developed to actually figure out if it's on the left or right side. So that's really interesting too. Let's see. Okay, so yeah.
So with that, do you have a rough idea of how far an animal is? Far away an animal?
Yeah, so the only way we can do that right now is once the animal is at about 90 degrees from us, we can take a distance estimate. So each line here is 1 nautical mile, and you can click around, double click on this plot to calculate, okay, from this point to our track line, it's about 1 mile, 1 nautical mile, 2 nautical miles. And that's pretty much the way we can do it right now. Yeah. So another project we can use, we use Tote hydrophone array data for, is for classifying species. You have a question in the back?
Yeah, what is the speed of sound on the water?
It's about 1,500 meters per second. So it travels really well underwater.
Yeah.
So how many miles an hour is that?
I don't know. I haven't done that conversion. But one of the projects I'm currently working on is using the whistles, those squiggly white lines that you saw earlier, to identify species of 3 different stocks, or they call it stocks. So they're the false killer whales. And, oh, I don't have a picture of them up here actually, but if you've ever seen them, they're actually a big black dolphin. They're larger than a spinner or a bottlenose dolphin, and they're black in color. And here in Hawaii, other one. Here in Hawaii, and this is the Hawaiian Exclusive Economic Zone, which is the way that we have management. We focus our management effort. There's 3 different genetically distinct stocks, all in this one area. So that's actually pretty unusual. So it's the only way now to identify them is getting a tissue sample and doing genetic analysis, which is really difficult and expensive. So if we could use passive acoustic monitoring data to figure out which false killer whale stock we're encountering, that would be really helpful. This is part of what the analysis is called. I can answer more questions about that later, but it's basically taking the characteristics of the whistle and classifying them in this random forest of decision trees to then figure out which stock that this whistle belongs to. And if you have more questions, I'd be happy to answer them later. But preliminary data have shown that it is actually possible to classify to classify the stocks using the whistles. So some of the results I acquired a year ago or so showed that here is the classified stock from the random forest analysis, and this is the true stock. So this little matrix shows that 80% of the whistles that we used were correctly classifying to the pelagic false killer whale stock. And then it also showed the northwestern Hawaiian Island stock, which is this blue line here, did not do so well. So we actually just have more data to use in the analysis. And that's actually part of my dissertation research. And the good one here is the main Hawaiian Island stock, which is just here on the main Hawaiian Islands. And yeah, they did really great. The whistles seem to be really clearly main Hawaiian Islands related. So yeah, there's hope and there's more data. So I'm looking forward to pursuing that analysis.
Is a false killer whale different than a killer whale?
It is, yeah. The killer whales are the orca, the black and white, larger looking dolphin, and the false killer whales are named for that. Their morphology of their skull is very similar, so the first people who actually discovered them thought, okay, well, we'll just name them false killer whales.
So they don't eat seals?
I don't think so. I bet if they were near them, they would try, but I don't know if they're large enough. They tend to go towards mahi and tuna.
What?
They tend to eat mahi or tuna primarily, at least here in Hawaii. So yeah, moving on to the other, another passive acoustic monitoring system. This is a HARP, this device here. It's the bottom-mounted hydrophone, and the HARP is an acronym for the High Frequency Acoustic Recording Package. And yeah, that is the one that we use to deploy off a ship and leave it there for months at a time, especially in really remote areas. These are really useful devices to collect data for places we don't get to go to very often. So they can record anything from a baleen whale, like a humpback or blue whale, really, really low frequencies to anything really high, such as like a dwarf sperm whale and any dolphin really, so it can record everything. And yeah, depending on how you set up the recording and how much battery power you have, you can leave that out there for years. So, and then just pick it up whenever you can. So yeah, the primary reason we use this is to study certain species on a larger spatial and temporal scale. So you can get seasonality, like you can know when a certain species is in a given area year-round, or when they leave that site, when they're there. So it's really an interesting way to collect data.
Do they self-ascend to the surface?
No, actually, you have to go to the site where you dropped it and ping it. You send like an acoustic signal down to it, and it releases using another device that's hooked up in a certain way that once you ping it to release, everything floats up to the surface. So, and then you actually have to use the visual observers to find it.
How much do they cost?
I think around, how much do you think, Eric? Is it
$400,000.
$80,000 to $100,000? So they're quite expensive, but they can be used over and over again. And I think,
How many are there?
well, actually, this map shows all the sites that we have currently we are currently using them at all the green stars. So what is that, 5 to 6? Yeah, so 6 of them are deployed right now across the Pacific.
I went snorkeling with a underwater video camera,
Yeah,
and I didn't hear any noises when I was snorkeling, but when I played the video back, there were all these popping and clicking
Oh.
noises.
that's interesting.
And I don't know if those are shrimp or what, but your machines pick that noise up.
Yeah, and we tend to choose sites that might minimize that, and they're at deeper depths, because sometimes shrimp are in shallower areas, and reefs can make a lot of noise too, with just the water movement over them, and all the fish are around as well, and those can actually make more noises than you would expect. So that's neat that your recorder picked that up. So yeah, this is pretty much how we're using these bottom-mounted hydrophones, the HARPs. And there's a lot of really fascinating data sets that have come from this effort. One of those is for the beaked whale. How many of you know what a beaked whale, or have ever heard of a beaked whale before? Cool. Okay, more than I thought. Sometimes people have no idea what a beaked whale is. So for us, they are one of the tougher species to find visually. They're super sneaky. They like to just surface right below the water line and then dive right down. And they dive for hours at a time. So it's really hard to study them only using visual observers. So yeah, difficult to study them. However, their echolocation characteristics are really useful in studying them. The clicks they make can be heard all across the Pacific. All those sites I showed you, the clicks are heard all across those sites. And they can be used to actually figure out what species are present. So the top little graph here, they call that a waveform. That's just another way to characterize. This is the spectrogram, which this is a very zoomed in click. That's a single click right here. That's the time, and that's the frequency. So this one is about just under 50, and it sweeps up to almost 100 kilohertz. And this is just another way to depict the different frequencies that the click entails. But you can use these data to figure out what is actually there. And this is another type of beaked whale, the Cuviers. This was the Blainvilles. It has very different characteristics. Mostly it's good to look at this one. You can see how it peaks here, and this one is shaped differently. There's also a third type of whale, and this is the elusive cross-beaked whale. We don't actually know which species this is. We just know that this click exists on a lot of the harp sites, but nobody has ever visually confirmed the clicker with this animal with the acoustics. So it's kind of still one of the mysteries that we're trying to solve, which makes our job that much more exciting. And for all the beaked whale data they've found on these harps, this is sort of how it breaks down based on the species. So the Blainville's is in green, so you can kind of tell on these little pie charts, sort of this is helping you look at the distribution of these species across the entire region and in Hawaii. And you can tell this yellow one, I can't really pronounce that, but the yellow beaked whale is primarily down here near Palmyra and Kingman. And we really would never have been able to figure this out without using passive acoustic monitoring. Because our ship time, we can't get there every year, let alone collect data year round. So it's been super valuable. And now, let's see, we'll move over to the Western Pacific, over where Guam and the Confederated Northern Micronesian Islands are. I'm sorry, Marianas, not Micronesian. And look at a few data sets from there at, let's see, Saipan and Tinian. So these are another example of a very remote study site that we don't get to. Maybe every 3 years we get over there, but the HARP data has been used to really figure out what type of baleen whales that exist over in that area. So let's see. So we have our humpback whales, and they follow the pattern that you would expect. They're there in the winter, just like they're here in the winter. So Saipan's on the top. This is Tinian, the data set for each island. And interestingly, though, the blue whales, they show up, yes, in the winter, but only in Saipan. They were only found to be in Tinian in the summer. So that's just another pattern you wouldn't expect. But the acoustic data helped us figure that out. And with the fin whales, they're kind of there almost year round, and then they leave in the winter. Who knows where they go? I don't, but at least we know they're there at these times of years. And then I think is the most interesting part is there's all these different unidentified whales that have been detected on the harps, and we can't classify them yet to species, but we just know that there's a ton of other whales there year round. So that's another example of we could not know this without using these recorders. Okay, so moving on to the data that we collect with autonomous recorders. And so this is the Sea Glider, and this is the buoyancy driven one. And this is a device that's, let's see, it's supposed to be used in the absence of ship time. So you're supposed to deploy it, and it's supposed to be able to cruise and dive up and down through the water column on its own. And it collects oceanographic data, such as temperature, salinity, and it just has a single hydrophone to record with, so that's up here. And there's also a detector inside, so when a sound is made, it triggers the glider to start recording, which helps with battery power and saves space in the disk. So yeah, this is just how it looks when it's diving down. It'll hit the bottom, and then things shift around inside to allow it to surface. And then it'll communicate its location using satellite. In the tail, it can communicate with the satellite, and so we can actually track where it goes. And there was one completed successful mission that we did in 2013, and that was off the Kona coast here. And this is just the track showing where this glider surveyed. We had it out for 3 weeks and did 135 dives. And we heard all types of cetaceans, including humpbacks, false killer whales, pilot whales, and a number of different dolphin species. And again, this is just a year that we didn't actually go to Kona on a big ship, but we were able to still collect data and figure out who's there and when. And in theory, we'd like to maybe get a fleet of these sea gliders eventually. There's a lot to figure out still with the glider, but it has potential. It has potential to set like 5 of them off on their own and perhaps cover a big study area. And then in some way, we could count the amount of animals as using this data. But it's not there yet, but it's definitely, there's potential. So the last recorder I'll talk about is this Carb. We love our acronyms. Just want to say we love our acronyms. Carb stands for Compact Acoustic Recording Buoy. Someone suggested, oh, then you could make a high carb and a low carb. For now, this is just the carb. we'll get to the other ones at some point. So just to point out what's what here in this really advanced graphic, this is what the data acquisition card sits in. It's basically just a very generic housing that's waterproof. So you stick the data card inside, seal it up, set it out. Oh yeah, there we go. There we are. So that's what it looks like. You can set what the recordings will be here, like the frequencies and the length of time and whatnot. And there's the hydrophone. There we are. Hydrophone here. That's about 150 feet below the surface, so you can get those deep diver or deep diving species like the beaked whales. And it's just connected to this buoy and flag in order to retrieve it later. So we can record really, really high frequencies, up to 192 kilohertz. That's way past our hearing range, but it gives us a lot of options. So if the visual observer team is on a smaller boat and they're out and they see animals, they can just chuck this over the side and leave it as they do what they need to do with photos and biopsies. And we can get beautiful passive acoustic data at the same time. No problem. So it uses actually a GPS dog collar to track it on a little remote. So that's kind of fun. And then, yeah, they go and pick it up whenever they're done with all of the other types of data collection. So the biggest success for the Carb so far has been to detect the dwarf sperm whale. Has anyone heard of this species before? No, cool, because we don't really know a whole lot about it actually. So to get acoustic recordings of this species is big. It's really special. So these are also an example of another elusive, sneaky species that's really hard to see unless the water's super calm. Once the waves pick up, forget it. There's no way you can really spot these animals. So that's why I put this painting up instead, because that's just the best way to really know what they look like. They have that square head that's sort of similar to the normal sperm whale. That's why they're named like that. Their dorsal fins further back on their body, their blunt head. They're just not as smiley and jovial looking as these bottlenose. They're bottlenose cousins, but I think they're still just as important. Plus, they have really cool acoustic characteristics where their clicks are super high. This is probably one of the highest frequencies of all the cetaceans. So it's also really difficult to collect that data. Just most passive acoustic monitoring systems aren't capable, except the Carb is, so that's really great. You have a question, Yosh? Sweet, okay. So here we are, the Carb is in action. We're off the coast of Guam, super close to shore. Our visual observer team is out on a small boat. They do this survey every year, and this year they just happened across some mother and calf pairs of Kogia, or dwarf sperm whales, which you can't really even see them, but they're right there. And here's the Carb, there's the flag. So you can see how close they are to the Carb. And that was super lucky. Like the stars aligned, everything worked out, it was great. They confirmed everything. They know it's the dwarf sperm whale. And literally this is the third recording ever recorded of a dwarf sperm whale, and the second time a wild dwarf sperm whale. So we just upped our sample size by 100%, which is really exciting. And just to give you an idea, this this sperm whale or dwarf sperm whale had to be facing just enough towards the carb to capture its clicks because they're so high. And I looked at this earlier and I realized you can't even see it because they're so faint. But within this box, you can see these really faint white lines. Those are the echolocation clicks of the dwarf sperm whale. And yeah, to have the third ever recording of it is really special. And it just is a really great example of how the visual observer team and what they're doing out there is super valuable. And then being able to collect this data with the passive acoustic monitoring system is just icing on the cake, really. So with that, I want to thank you for all listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yeah, you in the back.
Oh, yeah, I was wondering how many, like, do you guys ever get unidentified?
Oh yeah, all the time.
I mean, like, is there a bunch of, like, I don't say
Well,
UFOs, but like unidentified mammals out there?
Yeah, so one example is of that beaked whale, the cross beaked whale, that we still don't know who makes that sound, but it's been on all these data sets. They've just never been able to visually, yeah, you can't match it yet.
How many unidentified clicks are out there right now?
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but it's not that many. There's the bloop, there's the baleen whale, that some lower frequency sound that people don't know what that is. For the longest time, if you've heard of the minke whale, they're the smallest baleen whale, and they make a sound with, they call it the boing, and it sounds very mechanical. And the Navy would hear it all the time, thinking it was some sort of ship or, I don't know, some other submarine or something. But eventually, they had a survey where, I think it was here in Hawaii, that yeah, they heard it and they saw it, and it just all matched up, the bearings. So it will take a little while to figure out the unidentifieds, but overall there's not that many.
And then there's a lot of species that haven't been identified, like reverse it. There's species that don't know what they sound like yet. Oh
yeah, there's not that many, but I mean, the ocean is filled with a lot of unknowns. Yeah. So I can't really say for sure. Yeah.
I got one more.
Sure.
Could there be stuff out there that it cannot be recorded?
It's possible.
Like too high, you said?
Yeah, it's totally possible. If there's some species we don't really know about and they're higher than our current capabilities, absolutely. Even lower, yeah. Yeah.